Put your hands behind your back. Now." The command came fast, sharp, and confident, spoken by a man who believed he had already sized up the situation. Judge Nathaniel Elijah Carver turned with a calmness that surprised even him, still holding lilies in one hand and his wife's medication in the other. Officer Travis Whitlock didn't wait for any explanation. He moved straight toward him with a tone that made it clear he had already decided who Carver was. "You match a description. Don't argue with me." The lilies slipped from Carver's fingers. He didn't resist, didn't raise his voice, didn't do anything that could be twisted into a justification. He simply said, with a steady, exhausted clarity, "My wife is dying." Those were her flowers. Whitlock repeated the same line again, as if it were the only justification he could find. "You match a description." The handcuffs closed around Carver's wrists with a force that would have angered most people, but his expression barely changed. Instead, he looked straight at Whitlock, not with fear, not with anger, but with the understanding of a man who had spent his life watching choices ruin lives. "You're making a mistake that will cost you everything. Son." The words landed with more truth than Whitlock could handle. Before we go deeper into this story, where you're watching from, and remember to subscribe to the channel and give me a like. It helps these stories reach more people who care about justice and the lives behind these moments. Carver had left his office only long enough to pick up lilies and the medication his wife needed for the evening. Sarah had told him earlier that morning that she wanted a quiet night. Something simple, something gentle. The lilies were her favorite. For 24 years he had brought them home on anniversaries, after school recitals, after trials that wore him down, after long weeks when she needed something to steady her spirit. That small act had always mattered to both of them. He had done the same thing that day, expecting nothing more than a few minutes of peace before returning to the courthouse. Whitlock stripped that moment away in seconds. He never asked Carver for identification. He never asked a clarifying question. He never offered any information about the supposed description. He moved with the attitude of someone who believed questioning him was the same as defying him. Carver watched the officer's behavior with the trained eye of a man who had spent decades studying human decisions. Whitlock's movements were rushed, his voice tightened by something personal rather than professional. There was no investigation taking place, only a judgment already made. Carver could sense the frustration behind Whitlock's actions, a frustration that had nothing to do with him. He didn't protest, he didn't threaten, he didn't pull rank. He had seen too many situations like this end badly when pride met panic. Instead, he focused on the truth. A man with unchecked resentment had just chosen the wrong person to unload it on. Whitlock tried to maintain control, but cracks were already forming. His words didn't line up with his decisions. His questions had no logic behind them. His tone kept shifting, as though he were trying to convince himself he was doing the right thing. Carver recognized the pattern immediately. He had seen it in defendants who insisted their version made sense when the evidence screamed otherwise. He had seen it in officers on the witness stand whose confidence collapsed the moment someone asked a question they weren't prepared to answer. Whitlock was standing on that same fragile ground, and he didn't even know it. As the cuffs tightened, Carver's mind drifted not to his own predicament, but to Sarah. He imagined her reaching for the lilies that wouldn't arrive. He imagined the tired smile she always gave him when he walked into the room. He imagined the pain she hid from him out of love, even when her body was failing piece by piece. He thought of the medication he had promised to bring back before the afternoon wore her down, and he thought of how much this moment was stealing from a woman who didn't have many moments left. That hurt him more deeply than anything the officer could do. Whitlock radioed in a statement so quick and careless that it revealed how little he understood about the man he had cuffed. Carver didn't interrupt. He let the officer speak, knowing every word would matter later. Whitlock's voice betrayed a trace of uncertainty he couldn't hide. It was subtle, But Carver heard it. A slight shift, a shallow breath, a hesitation in the middle of a sentence. Signs that the officer already sensed something was wrong but couldn't admit it. Carver had been feared in the courtroom for his precision, his refusal to tolerate half-truths, and his ability to see through excuses within seconds. He saw through Whitlock the same way. He saw a man whose life had gone off the rails long before this day. A man who had no control over his own home, his own marriage, or his own son, and was now clinging to the last place where he still felt powerful. That power was slipping through his fingers faster than he understood. Even without raising his voice, Carver's words carried weight. "You're making a mistake that will cost you everything." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply the truth, and Whitlock felt it. His posture stiffened, his jaw tightened, but he pushed the warning aside, the way men do when the truth feels too close, when Carver was guided toward the patrol car. He didn't resist. He didn't struggle. He sat quietly, hands cuffed behind him, his thoughts returning to Sarah, the lilies she would never receive, and the long shadow this moment would cast over everything that followed. Whitlock shut the door without looking him in the eye, still unaware of who he had just handcuffed. But Carver knew exactly what just happened. One impulsive decision, one baseless accusation, one officer who had no idea that the man he placed in cuffs had the authority to reshape the future of an entire department. And as the door closed, Carver understood one more thing. This was not going to end here. It was only beginning. Sergeant Alicia Ramirez stepped out of her vehicle with the practiced focus of someone who had dealt with more crises than she cared to count. But nothing in her years of supervision prepared her for the sight that greeted her the moment she rounded the patrol car. She froze mid-step, as if her mind refused to process what her eyes already understood. Judge Nathaniel Elijah Carver was sitting in the back of a police cruiser with his hands cuffed behind him, posture straight, eyes calm, and the quiet authority of a man who had spent half his life commanding courtrooms. Ramirez's breath caught in her throat, her voice thinning to almost nothing as she said, "Judge Carver." "Sir." "What happened?" Whitlock stepped forward as though her presence threatened the version of events he had already committed to. He spoke too quickly, rattling off the same line he had used earlier, matched a description. Possible suspect. I took control of the situation. Ramirez didn't need more than 5 seconds to realize the truth. There had been no emergency, no active threat, no crime in progress. She knew Whitlock well enough to recognize when he was improvising. His voice wavered at the edges, not with fear of Carver, but with fear of what he had done. Ramirez didn't answer him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the man in cuffs, a man she had seen preside over trials with precision, compassion, and a presence that made even seasoned attorneys stand straighter. She swallowed hard, the kind of swallow that carried disbelief and the beginnings of dread. "Judge, are you hurt?" Carver shook his head once, slow and deliberate. "No, Sergeant, I'm not hurt." His voice was quiet, but not weak. He continued, only disappointed and very tired. Whitlock flinched at the tone. Not the words, the tone. Ramirez opened the cruiser door with hands that trembled just enough for Carver to notice. It wasn't fear of him. It was fear for him. Fear of what this moment meant. Fear of how far the consequences could reach. She couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes when she uncuffed him. She whispered, almost apologizing to the cuffs themselves, "This should never have happened." Whitlock tried to interject, but Ramirez cut him off with a command he hadn't heard from her before. Sharp, cold, final. "Stop talking." The officer's mouth snapped shut. Authority shifted instantly, and he felt it. A clean break from confidence to panic. Carver rose slowly from the seat, shoulders squared, looking not at Whitlock, not at Ramirez, but at the lilies that had fallen earlier and were now nothing more than a memory of a promise. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made both officers still. Today was supposed to be a good day. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sarcasm. It was sorrow. Not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that sinks deep and lingers. Ramirez knew, with absolute certainty, that the department had just stepped into a disaster. She could feel the implications unfolding before anyone made a single phone call. Judges didn't get detained. Superior court judges didn't get handcuffed. And certainly not this judge, the one who had built a reputation on fairness, discipline, and integrity. She asked Carver if he wanted medical attention, a courtesy she knew he didn't need but offered out of respect. He declined. He simply requested his belongings, his tone steady. Ramirez returned the medication bag to him, her eyes dropping as she placed it in his hand. When Carver whispered, "Thank you, Sergeant." She felt the guilt hit her like a personal failing, even though she hadn't laid a hand on him. Whitlock stood to the side, hands on his belt, trying to maintain an expression that suggested authority. But everything about him, his breathing, his posture, the tension in his jaw, betrayed the truth. His confidence was falling apart. He finally muttered, "I followed procedure." Ramirez didn't turn toward him when she replied, "Procedure doesn't include lying about a call that never existed." Carver didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than anything he could have said. Whitlock's eyes darted between Ramirez and the judge, searching for a way out, but there wasn't one. Carver adjusted his sleeves with slow, controlled movements, the kind a man makes when reclaiming his dignity piece by piece. He didn't ask for badge numbers. He didn't threaten litigation. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, a pillar of collected power. And Whitlock felt smaller with every second that passed. Ramirez finally faced him directly. "Officer Whitlock, step back. Do not speak. Do not move unless you're instructed." The look she gave him wasn't anger. It was devastation. She knew exactly what this meant. She had warned him for years to check his attitude, to watch his impulses, to stop treating every interaction like a personal battle he had already won. And now, the consequence had arrived in a form so catastrophic she could barely steady her voice. Carver turned toward Ramirez, his expression softening only slightly. "Sergeant, I need to go home to my wife. She's not well." The simple truth of that sentence cut deeper than any accusation. Ramirez nodded and said, "I'll make sure you leave safely. And sir, I'm truly sorry." He accepted the apology with a quiet nod. This wasn't about humiliation. This wasn't about ego. This was about a man who wanted to bring flowers to the woman he loved and found himself in handcuffs instead. Whitlock, still silent, finally understood the magnitude of what he had done. He didn't understand the politics, the procedure, or the legal risks, but he understood the expression on Carver's face. It wasn't vengeful. It wasn't combative. It was disappointed. And that disappointment frightened him more than an internal affairs complaint ever could. Carver walked past him without a word, and that silence felt like judgment. Ramirez watched the judge leave, knowing the next hours would unravel everything. This wasn't a story she could contain. It wasn't a misunderstanding she could smooth over. This was the kind of moment that defined careers, reshaped departments, and exposed patterns everyone had tried to ignore. She turned to Whitlock one final time. "You need to prepare yourself." He swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he asked, "For what?" Ramirez didn't answer. She didn't have to. He already knew. And in that brief, painful silence, everything that had been hidden for 10 years began rising to the surface. Everything Whitlock feared, everything the department avoided, everything Carver tried to prevent with one prophetic warning. The mistake had been made, the truth was coming, and nothing about their world would ever be the same again. Travis Whitlock sat alone that night with a bottle he had promised himself he wouldn't touch again, staring at the label as if it were responsible for the mess his life had become. The silence around him felt like a punishment, one he had earned over years of choices he never admitted were choices. He kept replaying the moment he cuffed Judge Carver, watching it loop in his mind like a film he couldn't pause. The truth gnawed at him. He hadn't detained a threat, or a suspect, or a man who matched anything. He had detained someone who made him feel small, someone who carried himself with a quiet authority he didn't know how to handle. That discomfort had turned into impulse, the same impulse that had ruined so many parts of his life long before Judge Carver entered the picture. His marriage had cracked years earlier when his wife told him she was tired of the anger he brought home every night. She had tried to stay for their son, Dylan, until the anger became more than a mood. It became a pattern, something unpredictable, something that frightened both of them. The day she left, she told him, "You don't even know what you're mad at anymore." She was right. He never did. Dylan's spiral came shortly after. A quiet kid who never fit into the mold Whitlock tried to force him into. He found acceptance with a group of friends his father didn't approve of. Whitlock didn't see teenagers looking for belonging. He saw disrespect. He saw defiance. He saw a mixed-race friend group he couldn't understand. And in one of the ugliest moments of his life, he lashed out at his son with language that left Dylan shaking. That night, Dylan walked out and didn't come back. The next time Whitlock saw him, the boy was handcuffed in the back of another officer's patrol car after a drug possession arrest. Whitlock told everyone he blamed the kids Dylan ran with. But deep down, he blamed himself. He never said it aloud. He never tried to repair what was broken. He simply filed the pain next to everything else he refused to face. The department had given Whitlock warnings he brushed aside. 2 racial profiling complaints, neither sustained, though everyone quietly agreed they should have been. Internal memos flagged his temper, his pattern of escalating situations that didn't need escalation, his need to assert dominance when he felt challenged. Supervisors noted he seemed to take certain calls more personally than others, but he was always just useful enough, always just short-staffed enough, always just senior enough to avoid real accountability. The phrase "we don't have the manpower to bench him" became the shield that kept him in uniform. He knew the system enabled him. He relied on it, and it fed something dark in him, something that needed control because every other part of his life was slipping away. That night, as he thumbed through old family photos he kept buried in a drawer, he saw a younger version of himself smiling beside a woman who once loved him and a child who once admired him. He didn't recognize the man in the photos anymore. He couldn't reconcile that man with the one who stood in front of Judge Carver earlier that day. Voice strained, story fabricated, confidence collapsing the moment Sergeant Ramirez appeared. He remembered the look in Carver's eyes, not fear, not anger, but understanding. That was worse. It was the look of someone who saw straight through him, someone who knew the consequences before Whitlock did, someone who had watched men like him destroy their own lives long before the arrest report was written. He poured another drink he didn't need, telling himself it was only for tonight, only because of the stress, only because the department was already asking questions he couldn't answer. He rehearsed a dozen excuses, each weaker than the last. He didn't comply. He reached into a bag. He appeared nervous. All lies. Even he couldn't believe them. Whitlock knew the truth. He had acted out of instinct. But not the kind of instinct the badge demanded. It wasn't vigilance. It wasn't training. It was resentment. Resentment at the way men like Carver carried themselves. Resentment at the way the world treated his own failures. Resentment at a son who no longer called. Resentment at a wife who no longer waited for him to come home. Every decision he made that day was steeped in that bitterness. He remembered moments earlier in his career when veteran officers warned him that he was headed toward a wall he wouldn't see until it was too late. He ignored them. He believed strength meant never admitting weakness, never admitting fault, never admitting fear. He built his entire identity on that belief, brick by brick, until the weight of it started crushing him from the inside. The day his wife filed for divorce, he punched a hole in the drywall and told himself it was the wall's fault. The day Dylan entered court-ordered rehab, he told himself it was the boy's fault. The day he cuffed Judge Carver, he told himself it was procedure. But now, sitting alone, replaying every second, he knew none of that was true. He wondered what Sarah Carver looked like. The judge's voice had shifted when he mentioned her, softening in a way that cut straight through Whitlock's armor. "My wife is dying." The words echoed now, louder than any reprimand, louder than any threat. Whitlock had taken away a moment meant for a woman who might not have many moments left. He had taken away something sacred, something small but meaningful, something that had nothing to do with policing or law or authority. That realization unsettled him more deeply than the possibility of a complaint or an investigation. He wasn't thinking about his badge anymore. He wasn't thinking about protocol or paperwork. He was thinking about a dying woman waiting for flowers that never came. And the man who carried those flowers with the quiet devotion Whitlock had once hoped to show his own family. He saw the truth clearly now, maybe for the first time in his life. The problem had never been the people he stopped. It had never been the calls he responded to. It had never been the streets he patrolled. The problem had been growing inside him for years, twisting every insecurity, every frustration, every failure into a weapon he couldn't stop using. He leaned back, rubbing his face with both hands, feeling the sting of tears he refused to let fall. The truth was simple and brutal. This wasn't about a description. This wasn't about suspicion. This wasn't about safety. It was about him, his bitterness, his grief, his resentment, and the part of him that needed to feel powerful because he felt powerless everywhere else. And now the weight of that truth pressed in on him, slow and suffocating, as he finally whispered into the empty room. "What have I done?" He already knew the answer, and the worst part was knowing there was no way to undo it. The footage hit the internet long before anyone in the department realized how quickly everything was about to unravel. 3 different recordings appeared within minutes of each other. One from a teenager who had recognized Judge Carver the moment the cuffs snapped shut. One from a grocery clerk who had seen the entire exchange begin to end, and one from a bystander who didn't know who Carver was, but knew something was wrong the moment he heard the officer's tone. The videos didn't need dramatic angles. They didn't need commentary. They didn't need emotional editing. The raw sound told the whole story, the hard click of handcuffs, the strained voice of an officer inventing a justification, and the calm, heartbreaking sentence spoken by the man being detained. "My wife is dying." Those were her flowers, within an hour. The clips spread across group chats, church circles, college networks, and legal communities, moving from confusion to outrage with startling speed. People who had stood before Judge Carver in court commented beneath the videos, writing about his fairness, his integrity, his consistency. Young lawyers he'd mentored shared stories of his generosity and honesty. Past defendants he had sentenced wrote about how he treated them with dignity even when delivering consequences. The disbelief grew into something heavier, something that felt like a wound to the entire community. A judge they trusted had been handcuffed without cause. A man known for discipline and restraint had been humiliated in public while trying to do something simple and kind. And the words Whitlock used matched a description, hit a nerve that ran deeper than the incident itself. By late afternoon, the quiet anger in Macon had turned into a collective decision. People didn't need leaders to tell them to gather. They didn't need signs or chants or speeches. They came because something inside them said they had to show up. 3,000 people, from both sides of the city, from every walk of life, converged in silence outside the police headquarters. They didn't bring megaphones. They didn't bring slogans. They brought lilies, white lilies, the same kind Judge Carver had tried to bring home to his wife. Some held a single stem, some held a small bunch. Some carried them in memory of loved ones whose experiences had never been recorded. The silence was powerful, a kind of unity that didn't require explanation. Officers watched from inside the building, unable to ignore the meaning behind the gesture. No anger, no violence, no accusations, just lilies, held in hands that trembled with grief and quiet determination. Inside a small hospital room, Sarah Carver watched the crowd through the screen of her phone. She was tired. Tired in a way that reached bone and spirit. The illness had stripped away most of her strength, but not her voice. When a local reporter asked if she wanted to share a message, she agreed, even though speaking was becoming difficult. She sat upright with the help of a nurse, adjusted the thin scarf covering her head, and looked directly into the camera with eyes that still held warmth despite everything she had endured. Her voice was soft but unwavering as she said, "My husband has spent his life giving people fairness. All he wanted today was to bring me flowers." That was all she said. One sentence. It was enough. The comment section froze for a moment, then filled with responses from people across the country who felt the weight of her words. It wasn't the drama of the situation that moved them. It was the simplicity. A husband trying to bring flowers to a dying wife, interrupted by bias and authority used wrongly. Whitlock watched Sarah's message alone in his living room, beer trembling in his hand, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't imagined her. He hadn't imagined the love behind the lilies. He hadn't imagined the quiet dignity of a woman fighting for every hour she had left. Her voice cut through whatever excuses he had rehearsed for himself earlier that day. He felt the truth of it settle in the space between guilt and fear, a truth too sharp to ignore. He lowered the bottle onto the table and tried to steady his breathing. He had known the judge's words would come back to haunt him, but hearing Sarah speak made everything collapse at once. He wasn't staring at a scandal anymore. He was staring at the human cost of his actions. A fragile voice, a simple request, a moment he had taken away without thinking. Back at the courthouse, clerks, attorneys, and staff members whispered in hallways, trying to make sense of the unfolding chaos. Some were angry, some were heartbroken, and some were afraid of the consequences the department would now face. Judges held emergency meetings behind closed doors, not to seek revenge, but to address the system that had allowed the incident to happen. The chief judge issued a statement calling for calm and urging people to trust the legal process. He didn't mention Carver by name, but everyone knew who he meant. Attorneys flooded the inboxes of city council members demanding accountability. Junior prosecutors cried quietly in their offices, struggling to reconcile the system they believed in with the reality they had just witnessed. Senior attorneys who had argued before Carver for years shook their heads in disbelief, muttering that if a man like him wasn't safe from bias, no one was. Social media platforms began tagging the videos as breaking, pushing them onto national feeds. Civil rights organizations shared the clips with strong statements about systemic failure. Politicians drafted careful responses, trying not to inflame tensions while acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. By midnight, the governor's office had already requested preliminary reports. The mayor issued a late-night press conference acknowledging the gravity of what occurred and promising transparency. But nothing eased the public's anger more effectively than Sarah's sentence. People kept replaying it, listening to the softness of her voice, hearing the heartbreak beneath it. Her message wasn't political, it wasn't accusatory, it was human. and it made everyone who heard it stop and think about the consequences that reach far beyond a single officer's actions. Inside his small living room, Whitlock refreshed the videos again and again, replaying the same 10 seconds, watching his own face in the corner of the screen. Cold, defensive, unyielding. While the judge he had cuffed stood calm and dignified, he saw strangers calling him every name imaginable, demanding his arrest, demanding his badge. But the public's fury wasn't what broke him. It was the sound of his own voice lying about a 911 call. It was the casual way he dismissed a dying woman's flowers. It was the moment he realized he had become the person he once swore he'd never be. He whispered to nobody. "I didn't know." But even he didn't believe the words. Meanwhile, Carver sat at home beside Sarah's bed, holding her hand, speaking softly to her about nothing in particular. Small things, familiar things, the kind that make time feel slower and gentler. He didn't want her worrying about the incident. He didn't want her burdened with the anger others carried on their behalf. He told her he was fine, even though there was a weight on his chest he couldn't describe. He didn't tell her about the crowd outside headquarters. He didn't tell her about the statements he'd received from colleagues. He simply sat with her, grateful for the stillness they could share, even in pain. By morning, the story had become the largest controversy Macon had seen in decades. The calm facade of the department cracked under pressure from every direction. Internal Affairs opened an investigation with unprecedented speed. Officers whispered among themselves, some defending Whitlock, others distancing themselves from him as quickly as possible. Supervisors exchanged urgent messages about the fallout, and the judge, quiet, disciplined, controlled, became the center of a storm he had never asked for. The city wasn't reacting to just one mistake. It was reacting to years of buried warnings, years of dismissed complaints, years of decisions made for convenience instead of justice. The incident was the spark, but the fuel had been gathering for a long time, and as the sun rose on a city now fully awake to what had happened, the truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a reckoning, and Macon was only beginning to understand how deep the rupture truly went. The courtroom felt heavier than usual on the morning the federal civil rights trial began. Not because of the cameras or the crowds waiting for updates, but because everyone inside understood that this case was no longer a local scandal. It had become a national test of truth, accountability, and the weight of a single decision made in a grocery store parking lot. Judge Eleanor M. Hayes, known for her precision and for shutting down theatrics before they could take root, took her seat with the same disciplined calm she had carried through 3 decades on the bench. She looked over the courtroom only once before bringing everyone to order, and in that moment, it was clear she intended to run the proceedings with the kind of exacting fairness Judge Carver himself was known for. Carver sat at the plaintiff's table with a stillness that came not from anger, but from resolve, a quiet presence that seemed to center the entire room. Beside him sat Regina Holloway, the civil rights attorney he once mentored, now stepping into the biggest case of her career with the determination of someone who understood she was carrying not just a client's burden, but a community's. Across the room sat Officer Travis Whitlock, shoulders stiff, eyes unfocused, the long months between the incident and the trial having stripped away any remaining illusion that he could simply explain this away. The opening statements set the tone. Regina delivered hers with measured control, outlining not only what happened to Judge Carver, but what the jury would see buried in the department's own records: 10 years of warnings, 2 ignored complaints, patterns of behavior dismissed because it was easier to look away. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize. She spoke like a surgeon making precise incisions. She ended with a sentence that made several jurors straighten in their seats. This case is about a man who tried to bring flowers to his dying wife, and about a system that allowed another man to turn bias into harm without consequence. The defense countered with an argument built on procedure and misunderstanding, as though what happened could be reduced to a moment of confusion. But the words felt thin, stretched, and rehearsed. The jury listened politely, but even from the first hour, their attention leaned toward the side that carried truth rather than excuses. The most jarring moment of the early trial came when prosecutors introduced the footage frame by frame. There were no dramatic visuals, no sweeping angles, just unfiltered sound, the metallic snap of handcuffs, the dismissive tone of an officer who didn't check identification, the steady, heartbreaking voice of a husband saying, "My wife is dying. Those were her flowers." Every juror watched the screen with the same expression, a mixture of disbelief and quiet anger. When the audio captured Whitlock falsely referencing a 911 call, Regina paused the playback and asked him plainly, "Officer Whitlock, who made that call?" The silence that followed felt like a confession. Whitlock swallowed hard and muttered, "I believed, at the time. The situation required—" Regina didn't raise her voice when she cut him off. "That wasn't my question. Who made the call?" Whitlock lowered his eyes. There was no call. The admission landed with the force of a verdict long before the jury ever deliberated. Halfway through the trial, Sarah Carver, frail but determined, was brought in to testify. The courtroom shifted into a stillness that felt almost sacred the moment she was sworn in. Her voice was soft, strained by illness, but steady enough for every person to hear the truth she had carried through months of pain. She spoke about her husband leaving the courthouse to bring her medication. She spoke about the lilies he always brought her when he wanted to lift her spirits, and she spoke about how she waited that afternoon, wondering why the minutes felt longer than usual. Her eyes never moved toward Whitlock, not once, as if granting him even a glance would give him a dignity his actions had not earned. When Regina asked her what the flowers meant to her, Sarah said quietly, "They meant hope. They meant he remembered who I was even when I didn't feel like myself anymore." The courtroom did not make a sound. Even Judge Hayes allowed a small pause afterward, not as sentiment, but as respect. Whitlock wiped at his forehead, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The medical expert who followed confirmed the severity of Sarah's condition, explaining how stress, delays, and emotional trauma could worsen symptoms for someone in her state. But it was her own words, not the clinical explanation, that carried the emotional weight. When she stepped down from the stand, Judge Carver reached out to steady her, and the simple act of a husband supporting his wife said more than any briefing could. The prosecution's case built itself one witness at a time, officers who admitted they had concerns about Whitlock, administrators who acknowledged understaffing being used as a reason to overlook early warnings, and internal affairs personnel who confirmed that complaints against him were not investigated thoroughly. Regina's final cross-examination sealed the shape of the truth. "Officer Whitlock," she asked, "when Judge Carver told you his wife was dying, why did you continue to treat him as a threat?" Whitlock opened his mouth, but no words came out. Regina waited. The silence expanded. He finally whispered, "I don't know." She nodded once and said, "The jury does." The defense struggled to present a coherent narrative. They called experts who spoke about policing difficulties, stress, split-second decisions, but none of it matched what the jury saw in the footage or heard in the testimony. Nothing justified the tone, the lie, the handcuffs, or the indifference. When the time came for closing arguments, Regina approached the jury with a calmness that matched the gravity of the moment. She didn't lecture. She didn't try to inflame emotions. She simply asked them to remember the sound of lilies falling from a man's hand, the sound of a lie spoken with confidence, and the sound of a dying woman describing what those lilies meant to her. "This case," she said, is not about anger. It is about dignity. It is about accountability. And it is about ensuring that power never outweighs humanity. She ended with the quiet strength of someone who believed in justice not as an idea, but as a responsibility. The jury deliberated for hours, not days. 8 white jurors and 4 black jurors returned with a decision that spoke with rare clarity, full liability, full responsibility, and a total verdict of $5.75 million, of which $5 million was punitive damages alone. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Hayes read the decision. When she finished, she looked at Whitlock with a gaze that held both firmness and sorrow. "This verdict," she said, "is for every time the department looked away." Her voice did not tremble. She did not raise her tone. She simply articulated the truth the community had felt for years. Carver did not react with satisfaction. He didn't smile. He didn't close his eyes in relief. He simply sat still, hands folded, absorbing the outcome with the gravity of a man who knew that justice, even when delivered cleanly, does not erase harm. It only acknowledges it. Sarah leaned gently against him, her strength fading, but her pride in him unmistakable. Regina exhaled quietly beside them. Knowing she had honored the man who once guided her through law school and given her an opportunity to serve him in return, Whitlock, meanwhile, stared at the table in front of him. The reality of what the verdict meant settling into his chest with a weight he could not push away. This wasn't simply a loss. It was a mirror that reflected every warning he ignored, every resentment he allowed to fester, every moment he chose authority over judgment, and every ripple of suffering that followed. The trial was over, but the consequences, legal, personal, and moral, were only beginning. The morning after the verdict, Travis Whitlock sat at his kitchen table staring at the termination notice he had known was coming, but still wasn't prepared for. A simple document that ended 10 years of a career he once believed defined him. The letter was brief, professional, and final. It made no mention of his years of service, no acknowledgement of sacrifices, no softening remarks about difficult duties. It simply stated that his employment with the department was terminated effective immediately. He read it 3 times, each reading cutting through another layer of denial. He had imagined he would be angry. He had imagined he would fight back. He had imagined he would stand in front of a judge and argue that he had been treated unfairly. But none of that came. Instead, he felt a hollow heaviness in his chest, something like grief but sharper. The house around him felt unfamiliar, as though the life he had once lived there belonged to another man entirely. He reached for his phone dozens of times, thinking he should call someone, his brother, an old friend from the academy, a union representative. But every name he considered carried a memory of a connection he had eroded long before this moment. No one felt safe to call, no one felt honest to call. And the truth was simpler than he wanted to admit. No one would answer. His wrongful termination lawsuit collapsed almost as quickly as it began. Dismissed without ceremony. The judge ruled that the department had every right to remove an officer whose conduct violated policy, training, and basic judgment. Whitlock listened to the order in a small room with fluorescent lights that made the moment feel even more clinical. The decision was delivered without emotion, without pity, and without any recognition of the turmoil that had swallowed his life. When he walked out into the hallway, he felt the quiet judgment of people who recognized his face from the viral videos. He kept his eyes down and moved quickly, but he couldn't shake the sense that he was walking through the debris of everything he once believed protected him. Job applications turned into rejections almost instantly. He tried private security companies first, believing his experience would make him an asset. Instead, his name triggered uncomfortable glances, whispered conversations, and emails explaining the position had been filled. One manager pulled him aside and said quietly, "I can't bring you on." "You know why?" Whitlock nodded, saying nothing, and left before the man could finish the apology he wasn't owed. He tried night shift warehouse security, thinking anonymity might work in his favor. But one employee recognized him within hours and pulled up the viral clip on his phone. The murmurs spread. By the end of the shift, the supervisor handed him a check for 8 hours and told him not to return. Even places that didn't look at resumes, bars, delivery services, odd jobs, seemed to carry the same unspoken message. People knew, people remembered. The lowest point came one night on the Tallahatchie Bridge, when he stood alone gripping the rail with both hands, the cold metal pressing against his skin. He hadn't gone there with a plan. But the moment he stepped onto the bridge, something inside him collapsed. He thought about the life he had destroyed, the life he had wasted, and the life he had hurt. He thought about Carver's quiet warning, "You're making a mistake that will cost you everything," and realized the man had seen the ending before Whitlock even understood the beginning. He pulled out his phone and dialed his son's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Finally, Dylan answered, voice tired, guarded, hesitant. Whitlock tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. He forced out, "Son, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't protect you. I didn't protect anything." There was a long silence before Dylan replied softly, "You kept everybody safe except us." It wasn't said in anger. It wasn't said to wound. It was said as truth. And that truth broke something that had been holding Whitlock together. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't argue. He just whispered, "I know." And the call ended without a goodbye. He moved into a motel shortly after, a place that cost $59 a night if he paid in cash. The room was small, colorless, and silent, but it felt like the only place where he couldn't do more harm. He drifted between days with no plan. Nights stretched long. Sleep came only in fragments. He stopped checking the news. He stopped answering the few messages that still came through. He stopped trying to fix anything, because everything he touched seemed to crack further. Instead, he began writing letters, not to defend himself, not to apologize publicly, but to speak plainly to the one person whose face he couldn't erase. Every month, he wrote a letter to Judge Carver. Some were a few sentences, some were pages long. He wrote about choices he regretted, about the things he should have walked away from, about the anger he never understood in himself, about his mother's warnings he ignored, about his son, about the life he believed he could reclaim, but now accepted was gone. He wrote the words he couldn't push past his lips that day in the parking lot. He wrote the truth he was too proud, too wounded, too misguided to accept while he still wore a badge, but he never mailed them. He folded each letter, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it away in a drawer that had once held pay stubs and utility bills. The letters became a ritual, a kind of confession without an audience. He didn't write expecting forgiveness. He didn't write expecting understanding. He wrote because he needed to acknowledge the person he had become, even if no one else ever read the words. The motel room filled with envelopes over the months, each one marked only with 2 initials, TW, as if he believed naming himself fully would grant too much weight or expectation. He thought often about the moment Carver looked at him with disappointment instead of rage. That expression haunted him more than any verdict, any news headline, any public criticism. It reminded him daily of what he had taken from a dying woman and her husband. He had taken a gesture of love and turned it into a moment of humiliation. He had taken a man's dignity and treated it as something disposable, and he had done it because he confused power with purpose, authority with wisdom, resentment with instinct. The fall was not sudden. It was slow, deliberate, and deserved. Whitlock felt each layer of consequence settle in until he could no longer pretend he had been unfairly punished. He knew the truth now with painful clarity. The verdict did not ruin him. The department did not ruin him. The public did not ruin him. He ruined himself long before that day at the grocery store. And in the dim quiet of the motel room, surrounded by letters he was too ashamed to send, he finally understood what Judge Carver meant when he said, "This will cost you everything." It already had. Sarah Carver passed away the following spring, and when the news reached the courthouse, the building fell into a hush that felt personal to everyone who had ever seen Judge Carver walk its halls with the quiet strength of a man carrying a private burden. 2,000 people attended her funeral: lawyers, teachers, former students, church members, nurses, people she'd tutored over the years, people she'd comforted during their hardest moments, and people who simply wanted to honor the kindness she had shown them without ever asking for anything in return. They came because she had lived a life that made others feel seen. Carver stood beside her casket with a composure that did not hide his grief, but framed it with dignity. His hand rested gently on the wood, not asking for her to return, not pleading for one more day, simply acknowledging the love they had built over 24 years. When the final prayer ended, he bowed his head for a long moment, as though letting her go required his entire being to stand still. Later that evening, he sat alone in the quiet of their home, surrounded by memories, every laugh, every difficult night, every hopeful morning, and allowed himself to feel the weight of losing the person who had anchored him through his hardest seasons. It wasn't a collapse. It was a release, filled with both sorrow and gratitude. When he returned to the bench a month later, the courtroom stood as he entered, not because protocol required it, but because respect demanded it. Carver didn't give a speech. He didn't thank them for their condolences. He simply began the day's docket with the same steadiness he had always shown. But those who knew him well felt a difference. There was a gentleness in his tone that hadn't been there before, a deeper patience, a softening around the edges that came from a man who had walked through something unthinkable and emerged with his principles intact. That summer, he did something no one expected. Using his own funds and without any announcement, he planted a lily garden in front of the courthouse. There was no plaque, no inscription, no dedication ceremony. One morning, the lilies were simply there, white, quiet, symbolic of something that went deeper than grief. People passing by understood the meaning instantly. The flowers represented love, memory, dignity, and the small moments that give life tenderness even in pain. They represented Sarah. They represented the day he couldn't bring her the flowers he promised, and they represented the promise he now made to honor her in a way that never faded. Every July 22nd, the anniversary of the incident, the people of Macon began leaving lilies at the garden. It wasn't organized by any group. There were no flyers or announcements. It grew naturally, year by year, as if the community felt compelled to acknowledge that what had happened should never have happened. Judges left them before hearings. Teachers brought them after school. Elderly couples who had never met the Carvers left a single stem. Former defendants left them quietly, sometimes early in the morning before anyone else arrived. It became a ritual that carried a collective message. Dignity matters, justice matters, humanity matters, and silence in the face of wrong only feeds the next wrong. Whitlock learned of the garden long before he ever saw it. People mentioned it on social media, in news clips, in quiet conversations he overheard in the motel lobby. At first, he avoided thinking about it, the way someone avoids looking at a wound they know they caused. But eventually, the knowledge settled into him until he could no longer pretend it didn't matter. Months passed. His life remained suspended between regret and survival. He attended counseling sessions as part of his probation agreement. He stopped drinking, not out of discipline, but because it dulled the truth he needed to face. And every time he tried to write to Judge Carver, his letters grew shorter, quieter, and more direct. Not excuses, not explanations, just honesty. He never mailed them, but he wrote them anyway, believing that telling the truth, even silently, was a form of accountability. A year after the verdict, Whitlock made a decision he didn't tell anyone about. He bought a single bouquet of white lilies from a store where no one recognized him. He walked to the courthouse at dawn, long before anyone arrived, and stood before the garden he had only seen online. He didn't step inside it. He didn't linger. He simply placed the bouquet at the edge, straightened it, and whispered, "I'm sorry," as though the flowers themselves were the only medium he deserved to speak through. It wasn't forgiveness he sought. He knew forgiveness was not owed to him. He knew he might never receive it. The gesture wasn't for absolution. It was an acknowledgement of harm, of truth, of the irreversible weight of choices. And he left before the sun rose high enough for anyone to notice him. He repeated the ritual every year after that. No fanfare, no signature, no attempt to be seen. Just one bouquet, placed quietly and respectfully. The final year, he brought lilies. He did something he had never done before. He included a small card with 2 words that took him months to find the courage to write. "I'm sorry." And then, beneath it, his initials, T.W. He didn't wait to see if anyone found it. He didn't linger to imagine how it would be received. He left as quietly as he came, carrying the understanding that apology is not a transaction. It is a truth that stands on its own, without expectation. When Judge Carver found the card later that morning, he read it once, slowly. His expression didn't harden. It didn't soften. It simply settled. He folded the card neatly and placed it in his desk drawer beside a small photo of Sarah he kept close. He did not forgive Whitlock. That was a journey he knew he wasn't required to complete. But he did not throw the card away either. Leaving it in the drawer was its own kind of truth. A recognition that accountability had been met with acknowledgement, and that remorse, while late, was still human. And as the years moved forward, the lilies continued to grow, symbols of love, symbols of loss, symbols of what happens when a single moment of bias ripples across lives in ways no one can ever fully predict. They grew in memory of Sarah. They grew in testament to the community that refused to stay silent. They grew as a quiet reminder that justice, when sought with clarity and courage, leaves something lasting behind. Lilies still grow, because some stories deserve to be remembered. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, take a moment to subscribe, give the video a like, and share it with someone who cares about justice. Your support helps keep these stories alive.